Order. The House and Committee is resumed on the Local Government Act 2002 Amendment Bill. Before the dinner break, we were debating Part 2, and the Honourable Annette King has the call. She has just under 4.5 minutes, should she require that.
Oh, well, I certainly will require
Honourable
it,
Annette King.
Mr Chairman, because I was just getting warmed up at this point, saying to the House that we'd just had an extremely passionate speech from the member for Rumataka, who is very well connected to his community and very well aware that any changes to local government areas up in the Upper Hutt area would be strongly opposed by the people up there, and he knew what was going on in his community. But he did ask the question about whether the transitional arrangements in Part 2 would apply to any deals that have been done for local government amalgamation in Wellington. And I have to say that my colleague did get something wrong. It wasn't a year ago that Nick Smith was working on these changes with the Honourable Fran Wild. In fact, it was for most of the beginning of this year, and I would like him to get on his feet and deny that he was meeting on a regular basis with Fran Wild around better local government. And in fact, I believe that she had a very large input into what we ended up with. But Mr Chairman, this part of the bill provides the transitional provisions if there is a reorganisational proposal. And I was hoping that we would have a minister in the chair who would be able to explain what the transitional provisions would be. But unfortunately, we're on the third minister in the chair. None of them have been responsible for the bill. None of them have been able to open their mouths. They've all had their heads down doing whatever they're doing, crossword puzzles or Sudoku or whatever, but they have not been concentrating on this bill. They've contributed nothing to this debate. Now, wouldn't you think that was pretty insulting for local government in New Zealand and people who support local democracy that you could not have a minister who could stand up and even make a little contribution, even if it was, I move that the question be now put. You know, that was Maggie Barry's contribution to this debate, and I'm hoping she's got a lot to say. I'm hoping she's got a lot to say on the transitional provisions, because I will be mightily surprised if she has. Because what we found out in the Select Committee is, if you have a look at this page, it is pretty much a blank one about the transitional arrangements, because no, it goes into the schedule after that, and if you wanted to know what the transitional arrangements are, which we tried to find out, members of the Select Committee, we found it as a work in progress. That's how I'd put it, a work in progress. A lot of what's going to happen in the transitional arrangements, not the reorganisational arrangements, but the transitional arrangements, are going to be worked out at some later undefined date. And if you recall, we did ask, why didn't they consult with Local Government New Zealand on some of the ways the transition would take place? And in fact, it was because the opposition insisted that we send part of this back to the Internal Affairs Senate, back to Local Government New Zealand, that they actually got an input into the transitional arrangements at all, because they have not been consulted. And that is what's come through in so many of these submissions that we receive from local government, the lack of consultation. And you would have thought that when you wanted to have a reorganisational take place, that you would work with Local Government New Zealand and say, what works? How would it work? What would a chief executive do? What would a council do? How many councillors would you need to have in a transition, etc.? But you would have thought that was very sensible. Well, there is a lack of clarity at the Select Committee around the transitional provisions. And we can certainly talk when we get to the schedule about the reorganisation provisions, and there's quite a lot in there and quite a lot of work. But this is an area where I think that could have done, Mr Chairman.
Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. This is an area where I believe a lot more consultation and work could have been done. I am really very, very sorry that Peter Dunn hasn't contributed to this debate, and particularly around the transitions, because he is a Member of Parliament in Wellington. And we know that there are 3 or 4 areas that Nick Smith's had his eye on for amalgamations for some time, and those areas know what they are. The Hawke's Bay know that they are under the gun, that they are looking at amalgamation in Hawke's Bay, Hastings, Napier, Wairoa, the southern Hawke's Bay area. They know that they are one of them. The other one, of course, is Christchurch, and one of the reasons that they've delayed the elections for ECAN is so that they can, when they get their rearranged council in place, they'll have an election perhaps on the rearrangement, but not on ECAN elections at this next election. We also know that the far north, and they themselves are interested, and maybe they'll come up with their own arrangement because they'll work it through. And the other one is Wellington, which is why I am very disappointed that Peter Dunn has not made a stand or made a comment on any arrangements here for Wellington. And it was interesting to read in the Whakatane Beacon, I think, where the deputy leader of his party, Judy Turner, said only a few days ago that and she's the deputy mayor of Whakatane, my colleague reminds me. She said in the paper that Peter Dunn was considering his position on this bill, that he had not made up his mind. And so when we get a vote in the Part 1, we have Peter Dunn voting against everything. So he's either duped his deputy, or he never ever intended to consider changing his mind on this bill. I was also surprised that the Maori Party voted against the 4 well-beings. And that was a surprise to me, because they have insisted that that well-beings are included in all the treaty legislation that we've been passing through this House. So it's okay to have it in treaty legislation, but they voted against my amendment to include the 4 well-beings in the Local Government Act. That would be hypocrisy, in my view. To actually insist in it when it's legislation that you're interested in as a Maori party, but because local government's not so interesting to you, you don't support the well-beings being in that legislation. So I think that this is a poorly thought out part of this legislation, and I have moved a supplementary order paper to clause 27, and what I've moved is some very sensible ways that you'd go about a transition. And in it I say that you should consult with all the affected parties, including the stakeholders and the staff involved in any transition, because they ought to know what is happening. It's not a transition made with a small group of people. You need to involve the staff, you need to involve the real stakeholders in any changes that are going to be made in a reorganisation proposal. And I believe it's got to be conducted in trust and good faith in the negotiations, and I have included some of these in my supplementary order paper. I said it also should be based on principles. Imagine that. Imagine having a bill that's based on principles. What a unique idea for this government. And the principles that I have suggested is that they must be, any changes, any transition needs to be evidence-based and have a clear and robust rationale and be derived from some very key issues. One, they must provide good governance and be capable of adapting to meet immediate needs in the long term for that community. These are sensible suggestions. I suspect the Minister and the Chair wouldn't have read any of the SOPs. He probably doesn't even know what SOPs the Minister himself is proposing. But I would say if he does nothing tonight, when he's finished his Sudoku, that he actually picks up the supplementary order paper that I have put into this particular provision and the transitional provision, clause 27, have a read of it, because it is an extremely sensible way of going about transition and reorganisation. And it comes from work that has been done on transitional arrangements and reorganisations out of Australia and working with local government New Zealand in this country. And I believe it's a very good suggestion.
Eugenie Sage.
Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to take a short call on Part 2 of the bill, not because we support it,